Hello, everyone. I'm Aya Saeed, president of the Muslim Law Student Association, and I have the privilege of introducing to you all our wonderful Professor Stilt today. Professor Stilt is before joining HLS, she was a professor of law and history at Northwestern University. She also received a JD from the University of Texas School of Law and a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies and History from Harvard University. Professor Stilt's research focuses mainly on Islamic law and society, both in a historical and a contemporary context. She was named the Carnegie Scholar for her work on constitutional Islam in 2013 and was awarded the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship. She also received awards from the Fulbright and Fulbright-Hays Foundations, and today will be among the first of many presentations on her research on the process of including kindness to animals in the Egyptian constitution.
Thank you.
Please join me in welcoming Professor Stilt.
Thank you so much, Aya. Thank you so much for coming out today for the first of a very busy Animal Law Week. And thank you to all the co-sponsoring organizations and to Aya and to Jess and everyone here. So attention to animal rights and welfare is growing worldwide, as we all know. So despite this growing attention to animals, very few countries provide protections for animals in their constitutions. So unlike basic rights more generally, where there's a trend towards textual convergence in constitutions around the world, granting constitutional rights to animals is new and very slow-moving. But in 2014, Egypt joined the small club of countries with constitutional protections for animals. And the opportunity for a new constitution came as a result of a 2011 revolution that ousted the authoritarian president, Hosni Mubarak. As you might recall from that time, initially after the revolution, the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamist-leaning group, gained political dominance. And they controlled the process by which that first post-revolutionary constitution of 2012 was drafted. And that constitution did not recognize animals. But after a year of Muslim Brotherhood control, the military stepped in what was essentially a military coup and installed a caretaker government that was a little more moderate about the role of religion in the state. And it selected a new constitutional commission that oversaw the rejection of the 2012 Constitution and the adoption of a new one. So the 2014 Constitution recognizes animals, not in its own article, but in an article dealing with the environment mainly. So the article reads, and this is adopted from the 2014 Constitution, the state shall protect its seas, shores, lakes, waterways, and natural reserves. Trespassing, polluting, or misusing any of them is prohibited. Every citizen has the guaranteed right to enjoy them. The state will provide for the protection and development of green space in urban areas, the preservation of plant, livestock, and fish resources, the protection of endangered species, and the kind treatment of animals, all according to law. So a constitutional guarantee for animal welfare seems very unlikely in the Egyptian context. The contemporary animal rights movement in Egypt dates to about the year 2000, and since that time it's developed quite quickly. But despite the efforts of dedicated activists, the situation for animals in Egypt is quite grave. So in a recent survey by the World Animal Protection Organization in 2014, Egypt received an F, although the scale was A to G, right? So it could have been worse. And the violation of rights of animals is quite long, but before I give a quick sampling of these, let me clarify that Egypt is not the only country with a grave situation for animals. The US, for example, received a D. The A grades went to the UK, Switzerland, and Austria. So just a quick overview of the problems in Egypt that will set the frame for this really remarkable development of animal protection. So wildlife is not adequately protected. And reports of wealthy tourists guided by Egyptian profiteers to hunt endangered wildlife in the Sinai has been well documented. Right. Cairo is a well-known illicit transportation hub for wildlife, captured in Africa and traveling to private zoos in the country, in Europe, and in the Gulf. Captive bred wildlife, the offspring of animals captured in the wild and now held in zoos, national and private, also fares very poorly. Here's the zoo. One well-known animal welfare advocate carefully monitors the lions and other animals at the Giza Zoo, documenting their treatment and deaths. And here is a protest outside the Giza Zoo in this very brief moment after the revolution when public protest was considered safe. Of course, it's not today, and I'll talk more about that at the end. Right? Pet shops are unregulated. Animals suffer and die while waiting for sale. Millions of stray cats and dogs live in Egypt. The government leaves strychnine-laced meat on the ground for them to eat and die a long and horrible death as a result, and also attempts to fatally shoot dogs. Neither is effective in killing them or in reducing the overall population. Right. The government's decision in 2009 to kill more than 300,000 pigs in the country as a preventative measure against what was erroneously called swine flu drew international attention, and also was seen as an attack against the Christians who raised these pigs. Even then, there's some very brave activists out there saying essentially, we reject the bearing of live pigs, which is what happens. So Egyptian activists have documented all of these abuses extensively and submitted volumes of complaints to the authorities, but really to no avail. And while there were laws that include provisions dealing with animals, like the penal code, the agricultural law, and the environmental law, these provisions were outdated, inadequate, and not enforced. All right, so in my talk today, I'm going to explain how this provision of kindness to animals, keeps jumping, was adopted, tying together the women's movement and Islamic law in the process. The constitutional provision marked a new moment for the animal cause in Egypt and on the national scene, really, there in particular. So prior to that time, activists had been mainly working at the level of individual behavior, the way that individuals treat animals on a daily basis, mainly because in the era of the authoritarian president Hosni Mubarak, they had literally encountered this brick wall of resistance to any kind of efforts to improve things on the governmental level. So they couldn't get an animal welfare law, and there was no receptivity to talking even about some of the worst abuses. But throughout the late 1990s and picking up in the 2000s in particular, in their work trying to improve the situation of how individuals treat animals, they tended to rely on Islamic arguments. And this is for a range of reasons, including but not limited to their own personal piety. It was their own particular belief. Egypt is 90% Muslim and a fairly religious society, so even regardless of their own beliefs, they were aware that these arguments were quite effective in talking with people. And more importantly, Islamic law offers strong support for animal welfare, but not uniformly so, as I'll talk about in a minute. So this for them seemed an important space in which to operate, to teach the helpful parts of Islamic law towards animals, and to downplay or reinterpret negative teachings. But the constitutional drafting process after the revolution required these activists to operate on a different level. No longer was this about instructing the so-called man on the street how they should treat animals. Now they had to speak to constitutional drafters who had a much more complex view of law and public policy. The 2014 commission in particular was more diverse and cosmopolitan in outlook than its 2012 predecessor. So the activists had to feel their way through new kinds of arguments, struggling a little, as I'll talk about, and finally finding their way to convince the drafters with an array of arguments that animals should receive some protection. So that's the story I want to tell you today, how we go from a terrible situation prior to the revolution to a constitutional provision in 2014. So my talk is in 3 parts, and I'll finish in time for you to ask questions. The first part's a very general introduction to the landscape of animal protection in Egypt, with a focus on the organizations that have really pushed the cause forward. Second turns to Islamic law, with the goal of providing you just a little sense of how the activists used Islamic law in their advocacy and the challenges that may have come along with it. And then the third part turns to the constitutional process. So first, the animal scene. When I talk about the Egyptian animal protection movement, people in the US are usually very surprised that there is such a movement. So I want to say a little bit about that landscape to start. So the oldest existing group is the Brooke Hospital. And by the way, I've pulled their English language materials for these purposes, but it doesn't mean they don't have parallel facing Arabic language materials for the domestic audience. But they're also kind of speaking to the international scene as well. So the oldest group here is the Brooke Hospital for Animals. It was founded actually by a British woman, Dorothy Brooke, in 1934 to take care of the horses that the British were leaving behind when they left after the war. But it was eventually nationalized and became a very important Egyptian NGO. And its motto, as you can see, is animal welfare and human development for the Arab region. So they really emphasize how human development depends on having working animals in particular. But in the 2000s, 3 new Egyptian NGOs emerged, each focused on a common set of goals: sheltering for cats and dogs in urgent need of attention, supplementing Brooke's work with donkeys and horses, or equines, and advocating for legal change, both on the societal level and the governmental level, although, as I already mentioned, that last part didn't go very far. Right. So in 2001, a former journalist, Amina Abaza, who is one of the stars of our story, and we'll see her more later, founded the Society for the Protection of Animal Rights in Egypt. Initially, she focused on sheltering and advocacy, and now she's turned her attention really much more towards education along with that original advocacy. So the Egyptian Society of Animal Friends, also as an NGO, started in 2002 by a group of Egyptians and non-Egyptians, mainly British, operating a small cat and dog shelter with the from now and again, monkeys confiscated from pet shops. But over time, the role of the non-Egyptians decreased, and it's now run by an Egyptian lawyer, and they also run a very important mobile equine clinic. As you can imagine, in a country where horses and donkeys are still used as working animals and people depend upon them, it's a huge service to provide free care for people's equines. And then the third one I want to profile is the Egyptian Society for Mercy to Animals, founded by a mostly Egyptian group in 2004. They run a very large shelter, are extremely active. Their Facebook page is one of the most active Facebook pages I've ever seen, and it's run by a television journalist named Mona Khalil. All right, so part 2, Islamic law and Islamic-based animal-friendly arguments. So Islamic law-based arguments have been very key to the activists, as I mentioned. So to get us to that point, I need to say just a little bit about Islamic law and where it stands with regard to animals. All right, so a little bit of background. All right, textual sources of Islamic law. The Quran, the word of God, is transmitted to Muhammad, the prophet, through the angel Gabriel from approximately 610 to 632 in Mecca and Medina. And then the Hadith, the speech and actions of Muhammad, collected after his death. Right. So as a text, the Quran is agreed upon as authentic. There are many differences of opinions about the interpretation of the Quran, but no argument is available or valid that challenges its authenticity. But the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, are a different matter. They're open to challenges both on authenticity and interpretation. And unlike the Quran, which is contained in a single volume, the Hadith are voluminous, with digital databases of thousands of Hadiths providing tools to modern researchers. So in terms of the authenticity of the Hadith, there's a standard scale, sort of rating from sound to infirm, or A to F, however you want to call it, gradations intended to indicate probably the Hadith's authenticity. All right, so with that background in mind, let's look at how these sources deal with animals. There's a strong sentiment of compassion, but not entirely so, and it's that little last part that caused the activists some difficulty. The Quran says very little about animals, but this is the verse that the activists cite the most. There is not an animal on earth, nor a being that flies on its wings, but forms part of communities like you. So the Quran, absolutely solid in terms of authenticity. No one can challenge that. But you see, this verse is not very specific. It suggests that they're like you, but it doesn't really tell you what that means, right, in terms of actual treatment. All the action is in the Hadith, which is generally true with a lot of Islamic law. So let me give you some examples on very pro-animal hadith. Again, these are sayings of the Prophet. We were traveling with the Prophet, and he stepped off to the side to attend to his need, when we saw a small bird with her 2 babies, and we took them. The people talking are his companions, the men traveling with him. The mother bird came over and began fluttering in the direction of the Prophet. So he said, "Who made her miserable by taking her 2 babies? Return them to her." So the Prophet's chastising his companions for upsetting the bird. Here's another 2. The Prophet cursed the one who treated animals harshly. Very broad, right? That's a great hadith for the activists. The Prophet passed by a camel whose stomach was taut, and he said, "Fear God regarding your treatment of these animals who cannot speak for themselves. Ride them properly and feed them properly." One of my favorites. The Prophet said that among us there was a man who was traveling and he became very thirsty. So he found a well and descended into it and drank, then exited when he saw a dog panting and eating the ground from his thirst. The man said, "This dog has reached a level of thirst that I almost reached." So he descended into the well and filled his shoe with water and provided water to the dog. God thanked the man and forgave him of all of his sins. The man listening to the story said, "Will we be rewarded for assisting animals?" The Prophet said, "There's the possibility for a reward for helping each living being." It's very, very strong language. And then the last one on slaughter. The Prophet saw a man who had put the sheep on her side, and while he was sharpening his knife, the sheep was watching over him. The Prophet said, "Do you want to kill her many times over? Why didn't you sharpen your knife before you put her on her side?" That's clearly concern with the sheep. But let's see a few hadith that aren't so clear. If a dog drinks from a vessel of yours, then wash it 7 times. That was one of my favorite dogs in the shelter that I worked with, who adopted many orphan kittens. Yes. So this is the washing of the bull hadith. There are many versions of this hadith or saying of the Prophet, the most common of which reports this. Other versions contain different numbers of washings, and some say to also wash with sand. The activists would often hear this hadith cited as evidence that dogs are dirty and dangerous, and thus treating them badly is justified. They would try to argue with people, no, it's just about if a dog drinks from your bowl. It's just about hygiene, right? It's not to say anything negative about the dog. But you can see this could be a problem. Here's another one. The Prophet restricted possessing a dog, saying that a person will lose 1 or 2 karats, a monetary unit of measure, daily if he keeps a dog other than for certain purposes. And various versions of this hadith give different lawful purposes, such as guarding, herding, hunting, and for assistance with agriculture. So what does that mean? Dogs shouldn't be kept for companionship? And what does it mean to keep? Can you feed a dog in the street, for example? So you see that the hadith are much more complicated, more detailed, but more complicated than the Quran. And there's much more material to work with, and the results are not entirely straightforward. Becoming very adept at working with the hadith requires many years of study in Islamic law. Those are not the animal activists. That is not their background. So activists use Islamic arguments, but they try to stay at a little bit of a level of generality, especially with the hadith, and they didn't want to get pulled into a more complicated discussion that they perhaps couldn't get out of. Well, but the dog is dirty. What about the bull? They didn't want to have to get into those complex discussions. All right, everyone good? That's our introduction to Islamic law and animals. All right, so now we move to part 3 where all the action is for this talk, animals in the Constitution. When the first Constitutional Drafting Commission began its work after the Revolution, some of the activists thought, well, why don't we go and appeal to it? I mean, we couldn't pass an animal welfare law, they thought, but why not go straight to the Constitutional Drafting Commission? They were almost afraid to really think that they could possibly do that. One of the activists, a woman named Dina Zulfikar, began these efforts with a vigil in front of the building where those first drafters were meeting. Her large green placard contains, the first part at least, the Quranic verse, the part that I read to you. There is not an animal on earth nor a being that flies on its wings, but forms part of communities like you. So she took up her own personal vigil. So that first drafting commission, as I said from the outset, was heavily dominated by the combination of the Muslim Brotherhood and the fundamentalist Salafist Noor Party. And the drafting commission reflected that kind of outlook. Dina Zulfikar said, great, I'm going to go to them on the basis of religion and argue that animal welfare should be included in the Constitution. And she actually found several receptive members. Her commission, her group of people looked at several different constitutions around the world, like India, that has some lengthy language on animals, but thought that language was vague, that they wanted something very, very precise. So Dina Zulfikar, this woman here, gave a television interview in 2012 during the drafting process in which she attempted to justify animal welfare on religious grounds. That's just the image. I'm not going to play it for you because it doesn't have doesn't have a translation for it. But I'm going to read you what she says, and it's fascinating. So Dina Zulfikar is not a religious scholar, and a traditional religious scholar might consider her secular-oriented and being from a family known sort of as part of the intelligentsia. So she sought to deploy religious arguments without getting trapped by the complexity of the hadith. She didn't want to hear negative hadith about the bull or losing money for the keeping of a dog, or etc. The result is a very strange spectacle. She sounds like a strict fundamentalist. And as she applied her approach to other areas of the law, like women's rights, like she would probably not at all want that result. So the interviewer asks her, what do you want from the Constitution concerning animal rights? And again, this is in 2012. This is the Constitution that's ultimately not going to recognize animals, that's going to fall, and we'll get to the 2014 in a moment. But this is really fascinating. It's an important turning point in this movement. So here's her answer. We are speaking with the Quran and nothing else. The Quran says there's not an animal on earth, nor a being that flies on its wings, but forms part of communities like you. We aren't inventing things, nor are we saying something borrowed from home or from abroad or from home. The source of Islamic law is the Quran. I won't give an example from the Hadith, so no one says that Hadith is reliable or not reliable. The Quran is completely clear on the point that animals have communities like we do, and we should respect them. So you see what she's trying to do. She's trying to avoid talking about the Hadith. She's trying to really hammer home that Quranic verse. And as a result, what might work with the quote-unquote man on the street sounds absolutely ridiculous on the national scene, right? It sounds extremely strict, extremely fundamentalist. So of course, no language ultimately reflected animal interests in that 2012 Constitution. But that Constitution didn't last very long. President Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president who oversaw that Constitution, was ousted by the military after extensive public demonstrations. The new interim president was taken from the Supreme Constitutional Court. He was a judge, a head of the court. He selected a committee of 50 to draft the new Constitution of 2014. These are just headlines showing you President Morsi is now gone. All right. So with this new commission, the activists said, let's try again. We failed in 2012. Maybe we went at it the wrong way. Now it's time to try again. All right, so I mentioned to you the Society for the Protection of Animal Rights in Egypt and the founder, Amina Baza, at the beginning when I showed you the different organizations. Here she is again. So Amina had not been involved in the 2012 constitutional process because she was entirely opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood. She is a Muslim. She uses Islamic arguments freely when talking with Egyptians. I've seen her do it 1,000 times. But once the Muslim Brotherhood was in power, and she thought that the country might actually adopt a stricter view of Islamic law than it had before, she actually became very concerned. She has very strong views on the need for equality of women and for equality amongst the religious minorities, in particular the Christians in the country, and she just stayed away in light of the Muslim Brotherhood's dominance. Here she is on the day that Morsi was ousted. So when the Muslim Brotherhood was ousted, she thought, it's time to get involved in politics again. But initially, she was not thinking about a constitutional amendment for animals. Despite her passion, during the Muslim Brotherhood's period of control, she was very concerned about minority rights and women's rights. And so her activities to the new constitution began with the issue of women's rights, tying in my title. So the women's groups were eager to get their agenda back on the table after Morsi's ouster. They felt like they had been pushed aside. They were worried that women's rights were shifting backwards a little bit. And when he was ousted, they moved back in. So due to her political involvement on issues regarding women and Coptic Christians, not animals, because no one really knew much about that, she was invited by the constitutional drafters, one of the members of the Constitutional Drafting Committee, the new one, to speak at a conference on women's rights. At that moment, she was very upset by murders that had just taken place a few weeks earlier, right before Morsi was ousted, very near to where her shelter is located. She had worked for more than a decade to stop animal abuse she would witness constantly in the street outside her shelter. And she was very invested in her community. So to her horror, it turned out that just down the street from her shelter, 4 Shia Muslims were attacked and killed in an act of a sectarian violence. My introduction to Islamic law did not include an introduction to the Sunni-Shia differences, or we'd be here much longer than an hour. But just take it that Egyptian is majority Sunni. There are some Shia, and sectarian violence flared after the revolution to some extent. An amnesty got involved. This was a huge deal. They were, their homes were attacked. Their homes were burned. In what is considered a mob attack in sectarian violence. This so bothered her that when she saw the news of this attack, she suddenly saw the relationship between all of her causes. Minority Christians, religious minorities, women, and animals. So at this conference on animal rights that I mentioned, she began her talk with the news of this attack. And she went on to link animal abuse and human abuse. And something that she told me kind of came spontaneously for her. To tie it to the topic of the conference, she linked abuse against humans and women and children in particular as the most common victims of abuse. She said, quote, "We're an animal welfare organization. We have worked for years in this street, helping the poor farmers, giving out religious books, speaking about God and the prophet and how the prophet was kind to animals, trying to send a message of compassion, trying to talk to people about kindness and religion. This is the result. The same people who tortured animals in our area did the same to the 4 Shia," end quote. She went on to blame herself, quote, "It seems we had not been courageous enough to deliver our message of compassion. Cruelty towards animals ended up as cruelty towards humans," close quote. So the reaction to her speech was so positive that she was asked to speak at an even bigger speech, a bigger event on women's rights. She was worried about being ridiculed for bringing in animals in the conversation about women's rights in this new, more august forum, especially at a time when there were so many problems in the country. But she gave the same speech in this larger format, emphasizing that, quote, "It is time to teach people and kids to respect life. Egypt should take animal welfare seriously," she said. And she told me that the reaction to her speech was so positive, with the exception of the head of a women's association. And Amina told this woman, "Remember El Torbini, who raped and killed more than 60 homeless kids? He started with cats. He was a cat abuser." Right? This is a book on criminal law and the rights of the child in Muslim states, right? The case known as El Torbini captivated the media and the Egyptian public for over 2 years, right? Essentially going on to tell you that this was a gang that attacked homeless kids. Amina won the skeptic over with her argument that violence towards animals leads towards violence towards humans. An argument actually that now we have empirical data on, but she didn't present any of that. So in this speech that she gave to the women's organization, she did not invoke Islamic arguments on the treatment of animals. where she had done so in the past many times with the man on the street, the woman on the street. At this point, she took a different approach. She talked about the link between abuse of humans and abuse of animals. Significantly, she said she didn't want to be a part of what she thought was the Islamic hysteria of the era of President Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. At that time, when she used to use Islamic arguments with people on the street, she never thought there would be a chance that the Muslim Brotherhood could reach a position to control the legal system and turn the country towards a more stricter interpretation of Islamic law. So with her success at the Women's Conference, using these human-centered arguments, she began to think about a constitutional amendment in hopes that the commission would approve. She worked with her volunteers, she prepared a draft, and she collected the signatures of thousands and thousands of Egyptians on a petition asking for the inclusion of animal welfare in the Constitution. She had this big stack of petitions, and she had no clue as to how to reach the drafters. So drawing upon one of her contacts, she essentially paid an office worker to go into the commission after hours and deliver copies of the petitions to the desk of every single drafter. At that point, she felt, that's all I can do. I did my very best. I don't even want to talk about it in the media for fear that our cause might be ridiculed. Then she hears from the spokesperson for the Constitutional Drafting Commission, who informed her the day the drafting was completed that the commission had included a provision in Article 45, as I showed you at the beginning, requiring the state to provide for kindness to animals. Okay? Just to remind ourselves what it looks like. So the language dealing with kindness to animals at the very end, right, is obviously shorter and less precise than what the activists had initially wanted. I didn't have time to show you their proposals, but they were quite lengthy. They were hoping for a whole article on animals. And while their petitions had indeed used the word for kind treatment of animals, al-rifq bi-hayawan, they had also used language calling for animal rights. And of course, that does not appear in the Constitution. So what about this phrase, al-rifq bi-hayawan, that I've been calling kind treatment of animals? This phrase was not coined by the drafters or by the activists, but rather has its roots in Islamic legal texts. According to the chairperson of the Egyptian Society for Mercy for Animals, one of the other organizations I showed you a slide on, she thought the commission was persuaded that some language should be in the Constitution, but they took the least controversial path, right? Since this language has Islamic resonance and a clear religious connotation, no one can object to it. They're kind of insulating themselves for criticism that it's imported by language that has some religious resonance. So what about this language? So what did the Constitutional Commission spokesperson say? So when I met with him last year, he told me that they didn't look to other constitutions when drafting Article 45. Nor really did they think that other constitutions didn't include animal welfare. In fact, they thought it was probably pretty widespread across the world, which of course is actually not true. He thought that the concept of al-rifq bi-hayawan, or kindness of animals, was religious in a general sense, but thought it actually had more resonance in modern Egyptian law than anywhere else, because he recalled that there was an organization in his youth that we would call the SPCA, or the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, that in Arabic was the Society for the Promotion of Kind Treatment of Animals in Arabic. So he remembered that organization as having the name, the language of al-rifq bi-hayawan in it, and thought, this is authentic Egyptian language. Right? So for the spokesperson of the Drafting Commission, including this language was not a difficult choice. He thought it was consistent with Egyptian law, Egyptian culture, and Egyptian history. And by law, he told me that he remembered that the penal code protected animals. Actually, the penal code protects your animal from me hurting it. But in his mind, the penal code had some protection for animals, even as just property. And so again, he thought that this was part of an indigenous Egyptian impetus and was not something that was imported or would be considered strange. So if you think about it, in the American context, this would never happen, right? There would be large agricultural interests who would rush in to prevent any kind of protection for animals in, my goodness, our Constitution. But interestingly, they didn't do that there. They may have felt not threatened due to the vagueness of the language. It's not exactly clear what this requires the state to do. They may not also have objected because it has some kind of religious connotation, and so objecting to it might be seen to be not very pious. So just a few more notes about how the language got in. In a very interesting television interview, Samawi, the spokesperson for the commission, spoke positively of Amina Abaza's proposal. And this interview that he gave gives us even more clues as to how this got into the Constitution. And here's what he said. Abaza was among the thousands who sent us suggestions for the Constitution. Her suggestion was very good and was signed by 10,000 citizens. It may not have been quite that many. It said that there should be an article in the Constitution on kindness to animals, which the three monotheistic religions all endorse. And the point of view of Amina and her group is very good because they say that violence in society, and as we are now combating violence and terrorism, begins with treating animals with cruelty. For people to become used to cruelty this way, if people get used to treating animals kindly, they will be kind to humans also. And so this article was included in the Constitution. So that's a news show where the head of the drafting commission is telling them, public, why it was included. So you see, he emphasizes that it's not just about the Islamic tradition, but all three monotheistic traditions. He's benefiting from the Islamic residents while not highlighting it as a reason, right? Sort of distancing himself a little bit from the previous drafting commission that might have put forward something just for its Islamic nature. And here he's tying it into the three monotheistic religions. And in Egypt, Jews, Christians, and Muslims are the three recognized religions in the Constitution and in society. Right? He really placed it strategically in its best possible place. Right? He refers to Egypt combating violence and terrorism in that particular time, and at that time is when the violence in the Sinai was really starting to heat up. And of course, that conflict has significantly expanded since then and has turned into essentially a revival of an authoritarian state. Right? So he accepted Amina Abaza's argument that on an individual level, violence to animals lead to violence to humans, but he expanded it for the national level. All right, so just to conclude here, the language on animals is less. It's not as big, not as much language, not as powerful language than the activists wanted, but they all see this as a huge victory for their cause. Their cause has been endorsed in the Constitution, and even though there's no clear sense of what it requires, they have a new argument when talking with people. So they all believe that now the next step is to push for an animal welfare law. However, a new legislature was enacted not long ago, but the activists are not at all optimistic that given all the problems in the country, their cause will reach the legislature's ears. And, as I hinted at a minute ago, a new era of political oppression is taking over Egypt now, making people very concerned that we've reverted back to the height of authoritarianism of the Mubarak regime. And here's just an example of not too long ago. Egyptian writer Fatima Note sentenced to 3 years in prison for talking about animal rights. Specifically, she says something actually that was offensive to many people. I'll just read you the top line. She was found guilty of insulting Islam after describing Eid al-Adha's tradition of slaughtering sheep as the greatest massacre committed by human beings. I put this up here really just to show you that there was a moment of hope in the 2014 Constitution. The activists got their language in, but the situation today in Egypt is not very good politically, and they're not hopeful that a new welfare law is on the way. However, just to end with a slight message of hope, the constitutional process served to get their cause on the national scene, allowing activists really to take their place alongside other social justice movements in the country. in the process of the drafting commission, they now really stand alongside women's rights activists, human rights activists. They all see each other as being part of the same social justice movement in the country. So in many ways, the constitutional process, which resulted in an important, albeit very small bit in the Constitution, really launched the animal movement. And so if I can make a long title even longer, I would just add to the very end that this is also about the making of a social movement. All right, thank you. I'm happy to take questions. I know people have class, but if you want to stay, I'm happy to take questions.
If anyone has, hello? If anyone has questions, just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you because the event is being recorded. I want to catch your voice.
Wait till it quiets down a little bit. Hi, I want to thank you so much for speaking on this topic. It's really fascinating to hear animal rights being pushed in other countries. So this is kind of a two-part question. One is, where do they go from here in regards to combating the newly authoritarian regime in Egypt? And what can other countries take away as the things to learn in regards to pushing forward these important laws in other countries?
Well, I think the first question is just a huge one. That's really beyond the scope of this movement or really any movement, right? So there is a level of repression now that does not look like a revolution happened. Right? So I'm going to leave that aside for now, but I think the other one is really important, right? What can they take away? So relying upon arguments that resonate in your society, right, is hugely beneficial, hugely valuable. This is not unlike the human rights movement, right, where oftentimes human rights activists, for example, are working with international documents and norms, but they're thinking about how to talk about it, how does it resonate right at home. I mean, the exact same thing can be seen here. The Islamic arguments were extremely effective. Right? It's just that all of a sudden when you're talking to the national scene, you can't just really rely on that, right? You have to talk about public policy more broadly in order to get an audience, especially in sort of a diverse and more cosmopolitan setting as existed at the time of the 2014 Constitution. So, I mean, what does one society have that can be drawn upon, right, when making these arguments, and not just coming in with international standards and norms, but using what you have at home? I think is hugely beneficial. The only problem with that, of course, is that religious law is really complex, and animal activists are typically not trained in religious law. So even as I showed you here, they were afraid of going too far into the Hadith for fear they wouldn't have a counter-argument or a response if someone challenged them on an interpretation, for example, right? So you work with your religious scholars, try to come up with some kind of comprehensive approach. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thanks very much for this informative talk. I want to get back to the cultural context that you raised at the beginning. There's not an animal on earth that doesn't form, I think you said a community like you, and that's very ambiguous. I don't know what it is in Arabic, but it could be a community such as the kind of community humans create, which would mean something quite different than simply saying that they form communities like you do. Mm-hmm. So I was interested in that, and there's not many forms of abuse and violence against animals that I could see being restricted by this statement. So maybe you could say a little bit about its purport.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I think that's the point. So that's what they grab onto because it sounds very good. They're communities like you. But when it comes to law and daily practice and rules, the Quran doesn't really get you there. It's all in the Hadith, right? And so the Quran, though, is unimpeachable in its authenticity, right? No one can challenge you that, well, that's weak or there's problems with its authenticity. So you've got this great source that's vague, and then you have this other huge source that's much more complex and complicated, and it's open to challenge, but gives you a lot more, Right? So that's ultimately the difference between these two kinds of sources. But you can see why someone who doesn't want to get into the details is just trying to stick with the Quran and sort of hope she can push it, use it to push as far as she can, but you run out of space. You can't go very far.
You mentioned that one of the organizations is run by a lawyer, and it seems pretty clear things have stalled legislatively, but I'm wondering if the constitutional provision has been deployed in the judicial arena, and if there have been efforts to make meaning of it in that context.
So not yet, in the sense that it's still relatively new. Right? It was, and there hasn't been an opportunity. Right, for there to be a constitutional challenge. I mean, they're thinking about it. They're thinking about what could it mean. As you saw, it's a little bit vague. Does that mean the state is required to have an animal welfare law? I mean, it's not really clear what you do with that. They've used it more strategically, more symbolically, though. I mean, that's really how they used it. For example, the penal code does have language that would allow you to prosecute like really overt public acts of cruelty, but the police just sort of laugh if you want to do that. But there was actually a prosecution a year ago of a very open public act that was filmed, and they said, look, it's in the Constitution, right? And they kind of use that as leverage to get the police to prosecute. So right now it's a little more symbolic or vaguer in its usage.
Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you very much for your very, very informative talk. My question has to do with there's at times I think that you made a decision to use the term Islamic legal arguments versus Islamic arguments, and I'm sort of interested in understanding where you draw the line, or where we should draw the line between what is an Islamic argument versus an Islamic legal argument.
Yeah.
I think this question would be relevant to us sort of drawing the boundaries of what is fiqh, or what is, and then also, like, for example, when the woman went on to the TV show and said, this is what the Quran says, X, Y, and Z. Would you call that an Islamic legal argument or an Islamic ethical argument, or what is? How do we conceptualize these categories?
Yeah, that's a good question. I probably wasn't using that as intentionally in every single. I might have just been using shorthand for Islamic arguments. But you're absolutely right to say there's a lot of ethical arguments, right? So, for example, the issue of slaughter, which I didn't get into, the requirements for halal slaughter are quite narrow, right? But there's many, many more hadith about the treatment of the animals as they're being raised, as they're being brought to slaughter, the knife, sharpening, for example, that don't make it into what you might call kind of the basic legal rules of slaughter, right? So is that ethical? What's the penalty for sharpening the knife in front of the other sheep? It doesn't make the meat not halal, but you've done something wrong at the same time, right? So I think that's an important question. I think that certainly the activists use whatever they can, right, in whatever circumstance that they can, or maybe aren't so careful about kind of the law versus the ethics. I think they're trying to draw as broad a circle as they can around all of this behavior, and doing using whatever source or whatever language that they can.
Hi, I was wondering if there was any sort of backlash from women's rights movements about trying to do this, because I can imagine that some women's rights groups would feel sort of betrayed in some way that this is at the forefront of so many women's rights groups, but not actually trying to pass an amendment or a constitutional provision about women's rights specifically.
Well, so I should say, though, that the women's groups were much happier with the 2014 Constitution than they were with the 2012 Constitution, right? So that's one thing. I mean, the other point is that for Abaza, you see her developing her own sense of the argumentation, right? So she's not telling the women's groups that women's rights don't matter or children's rights don't matter. She's just bringing in this other cause, like, if you care about women's rights and children's rights, you need to think instrumentally about this other way in which society produces bad actors, right? And so I don't think that they thought their cause was denigrated or downgraded. I think that she was providing them another sense of, you should be worried about this too. Look, there's empirical evidence, although at the time, she actually didn't have a stack of empirical evidence, but she had kind of anecdotal evidence from this case of El Torbini that this could lead to violence against humans. So it's like saying, if you don't educate people, right, they may take bad acts, right? If you don't provide them with the right social services and healthcare, et cetera. She's kind of adding in one more stick of, here's another thing that can turn, right, someone into a not great member of society. So I think for them, they're like, okay, that makes sense. But for her, this was an epiphany, right? That these causes were connected and that maybe she really should go to the Constitutional Commission because maybe they won't laugh at her either. So that's why I really highlighted this, because if it hadn't been for that moment, I don't think she would have had the courage to then go to the Constitutional Drafting Commission. And that's what gave her the courage. They didn't laugh at me, they thought it was important. Right. Did that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
I'm worried about Fatma, the woman who's been jailed last month. Is anything being done about her? And also, what about the very basics? Protection of speech, assembly, press. If she's been jailed for saying that sheep slaughtering is terrible.
It's a very grave time right now, I want to be completely clear about that. It's a very, very grave time. Many of you who follow Egypt might have seen there was an Italian citizen who was a Cambridge University PhD student who was found dead. Allegations that he was tortured and killed by the Ministry of Interior or the governmental apparatus are being widely discussed in an open way. It's a very, very grave time. There's no question about it. Prior to the revolution was also a very grave time. And some of the activists who had talked about the issue of slaughter then got calls from the Ministry of Interior. Like, I don't think you want to be talking about this. If you suggest that the entire meat system in the country is somehow not halal, that's a matter of national security, right? People to not feel confident in their meat supply. That's a huge, that's not what she's saying. She's criticizing the holiday in which an animal is slaughtered, but it's a very grave time, and I don't mean to suggest otherwise. Anything else? Oh yeah, we're at time.
All right. Join me in welcoming
you, Aya.
Professor Stilt for that wonderful talk, everyone. Thank you so much for
Thank
coming.
you.
And don't forget, tomorrow is the second event of Animal Law Week here in Pound 101, I believe. Thank you guys for coming.